Hi, folks. Welcome to Digital Debate Center. Today we're going to be talking about cross-examination. Cross-ex is one of the most requested topics for us to talk about, so I'm excited to have a chance to do that with you all today. So we're going to be going in a couple of parts. So first, we're going to start with talking about how you want to think about asking a cross-ex question. Then we're going to get to the other part of cross-ex that people talk about a little less, which is how you want to answer those questions. And then Adele and I will be doing some example cross-ex questions and answers for you. So, and after that, we're gonna have a Q&A session. So we're gonna get started with how you wanna think about asking a cross-ex question. So a lot of the rounds that I've judged, students have asked questions that don't really go anywhere. They ask questions like, well, what does this word mean? Or how many people are in China? Or something really broad or really specific that's tied to a broad idea that doesn't really matter much in the context of the debate round. However, when you're asking a question in a debate round, you want to ask something that sets up an argument that you can use later in the round. So how do you do that? Well, you can find parts of your opponent's evidence that you think would be useful later on to help you make your point. So if you find a part of a card that says something that kind of disagrees with what their argument is, then you can bring that up. You can read the quote from their evidence at them and be like, so your so-and-so author says blah, 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 blah. How does that work with the rest of your argument about what they're saying? So you can pull quotes from your opponent's cards to use them against them if you find any that you think would be useful. Another thing that you can do is that you can point out when you think your opponent has contradicted themselves. So if your opponent says something like, the American economy will always be strong, and they say something like, American economic decline causes conflict. Well, maybe if America's economy will always be strong, there wouldn't be any conflict because it's not going to decline. So if you find things that you think are in tension, you should call them out. So one strategy that you could use is in this year's topic with the manufacturing dissad, the uniqueness argument says that American manufacturing is strong right now. And then the argument gets into the fact that the plan would cause it to collapse. One thing that you could try to point out, I don't know if you would succeed with this, is you could say that the American manufacturing sector is so strong right now that something like the plan would be able to collapse it by asking a question like, well, how strong is the US manufacturing sector? And if the other team is like, oh my goodness, it's so strong, here's this stat, blah, 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 then you can be like, okay, thanks. And then later in your next speech, you can be like, they made all these great points about why the American economy is strong. We agree. That means that there's no link because the plan wouldn't be able to do anything to change all of those factors. So that's one way that you can think strategically about a cross-ex question. Another thing that you can do is you can set up comparisons between your opponent's arguments and your own. So I'm going to give you an example here. Let's say your opponent's impact is about a war between the United States and China, while your impact is about something bigger like global warming that would affect more countries, arguably. So to minimize their impact, you have a couple ways you can do that. So one example question is you could ask, how many nuclear weapons do the US and China have right now? So that question you could use to minimize the magnitude of their impact, because even if they can give you a specific answer, you can then work with it to say like, oh, well, all those nuclear weapons might not have as much of an effect as climate change when giving speeches later on in the round. Another thing that you can ask is, how would the American and Chinese economies survive a conflict? They might not be able to say they can. Your opponent might say, well, they wouldn't. Well, then you can follow up and ask something like, well, if the American and Chinese economies wouldn't survive a conflict, why would they go to war? You can ask questions like that to sort of set up a way that you can minimize the risk of your opponent's argument. And for time frame, you can ask them something like, the US and China have been at odds over Taiwan for decades, so what's new? Why haven't they gone to war already? And unless your opponent knows their evidence really well, they might not be able to provide you specific answers to those things. So even though all of those questions have answers, like we all can answer well, if we do the research, we can answer the question, how many nuclear weapons do the US and China have? We can answer the question, why the United States and China haven't gone to war yet. Even though there are answers to those questions exist in a round to start minimizing the magnitude, risk, or time frame of your opponent's impacts. So that's one way that you want to think about questions, is that even if there are answers to them and you can't stump your opponent, they exist strategically to serve a purpose. Another thing you want to think about with cross-ex question is you should focus your questions on the other team's speech. So that means you have to listen and flow and take notes on what the other team says, because you can come up with all the greatest questions in the world before the round, but if they don't read the cards that you need them to read to ask those questions, then asking those questions isn't going to be a good thing to do, because then the other team can just say, well, we didn't read that. Or the judge could say, look at you and think that you weren't prepared or that you weren't paying attention. So that's one thing that you want to do, is you want to stick to what's said in the round. However, that can serve a purpose too. You can use that to your advantage. Because if the other team didn't read an impact to their disadvantage, let's say, or they didn't finish reading the 1AC, you could ask them, well, what's the impact to your advantage, or what's the impact to your disadvantage? And they might say, oh, our impact is this, and then they give you the card that they didn't read, or they start talking about the card that they didn't read. Then you can say, well, did you read that in your speech? And when they say no, then you can say, okay, so you don't have an impact as of the 1AC. And that's a good way that you can get points with the judge, and that's a good way that you can set up a point later in your speech where you're like, well, only we have an impact right now. They haven't read an impact yet, so therefore, by default, we have to win, or something to that effect. Cool. And then the other thing that you should think about is you should think about what follow-up questions you can ask after the initial question. So let's take a step back. Let's go back to our how many nuclear weapons do the US and China have right now question. So that's a pretty specific question. We're looking for a number here. And you should think about the different ways that the team should respond when you first come up with a question. So, well, one thing they could say is they could say they don't have a lot of weapons. They could say, I don't know. Or they could say, that's not our evidence. If they say any of those things, you could say something like, then how do we know that a US-China war would end human life? How would it cause extinction? And if, even though you've asked a very specific question about a number of weapons, because you've asked that question, you can then follow up with something like that makes a broader point about what you're going to say in the rest of the debate round. However, they could also say, oh, the US and China have a lot of nuclear weapons, which would set up their argument that the US-China war would go nuclear and cause extinction. However, you also have options here too. So you could ask, then why would the US and China choose to use those weapons when they know they'll just be destroying themselves? So that question gets to the fact that the US and China would know that because they have a lot of weapons, they might not want to escalate the conflict. So even if your opponent answers a question quasi-correctly, there is still a strategy that you can use against them. And that's how you should be thinking about cross-checks. You should be thinking about it in terms of coming up with a question to set up an argument that moves on layers through different levels of follow-up questions. Another strategy with follow-up questions is that you can call out teams for exaggerating their evidence. So sometimes you might ask a team like, well, how many nuclear weapons does the US and China have? And if they give you like a specific number, then you can ask them where it is in their evidence. And if they can't point it out, that doesn't look too good for them because it looks like they just made something up. All right, now I think Adele's going to talk about how you want to answer questions.
All right, when answering cross-ex questions, the most important thing to know is that you have to know your evidence. Become an expert in the packet. We cannot emphasize that enough. The best way to do this is to read and reread your evidence. You should know every single card and be able to summarize each card. So if it's like chain evidence, or like, let's say that you have one card, you should know the author and you should essentially know what the argument is saying. Your opponents may ask you questions about very specific things and you will not be able to answer it if you don't know it yourself. And if your opponents ask you questions in general, then you should always be able to contextualize what you're talking about. So you should be able to say every piece of evidence in your own words at some point. If you don't understand things, it's possible the other team also doesn't. So you should be clarifying that with your support network, and definitely be writing notes for yourself and just making sure that you yourself know your evidence, because that's the best way that you are going to be able to answer questions and get speaker points. The second most important thing with answering questions is sounding confident. Knowing your evidence will help you with that, but also being able to reference your evidence. So let's say, for instance, if someone asks a question like, what's the time frame on your impact? If you have evidence that says that there's a conflict between the US and China that could escalate if both sides miscalculate with the other ones, then, for instance, you could say it would only be a matter of days after a crisis began for the two countries to pass the tipping point towards conflict per my, and then you would insert your evidence or insert the author. Versus if you say, oh, well, it could just happen in a matter of days. What Isaiah was talking about was this over-exaggeration. It can get you really caught up. So being able to reference the exact line that it says and knowing it yourself will make you sound much more confident and also just build a better argument. It's also great when you make eye contact with your judge. If you're looking at your paper or looking at your opponent, it makes it seem like you don't actually know what you're talking about. If you're confident and you're looking at your judge, it means that you know what you're saying and also you're able to express this without multiple distractions or notes, and it'll make you a much more convincing speaker. Also very important is to think before you speak. Sometimes you might feel like a question is a good one just because you don't know how to answer it. That's not the case. You have to think really hard, and if you're not sure how to answer something at first, don't hesitate to ask the other person to clarify what they mean. Sometimes if a question is phrased oddly or you don't entirely understand it, it doesn't necessarily make it a hard question. It just makes it a challenge for you from the start. So you have to take that question. You can ask them to rephrase it. You can ask them to come back to it. But simply passing it will not make you more convincing. And it also doesn't challenge you as a debater. You should be able to answer the question. And if you need to ask for clarification, that's absolutely fine. But don't shy away from it. I think that pretty much sums that up. We're going to move on to the mock cross-ex.
For sure. So yeah, so now Adele's going to try cross-exing me.
Okay. So, Isaiah, how can you solve for your impacts if there are other governments that these countries will buy arms from?
Yeah, so that's a good point. Unfortunately, the United States produces the best arms available. So even though there are alternative markets for countries to turn to, they're more than likely to keep buying from the U.S. or to try and adapt to the U.S.'s standards because, first, the U.S. is the best provider, and second, they already are a client of U.S. arms. And so if they try to buy from another country, then they would have to convert to all of that country's procedures and policies and whatnot, which they wouldn't be willing to do.
Okay, but if your plan actually happens, then they won't be able to buy from the U.S. So won't they just turn to other countries?
Well, right, they wouldn't be able to buy from the U.S. at the start. However, if they can get themselves off of the thrall and Germany risk index by potentially stopping their persecution of their citizens or increasing their freedom of speech rights, then they would be able to resume buying U.S. weapons. So the plan doesn't prevent all the sales of arms for these countries forever. It's just setting a regulation on who they or what they have to do in order to buy weapons from us.
Okay, well, how does your plan solve for human rights abuses overseas?
Yeah, so it's a similar point there. So even though these countries currently have weapons from the U.S., they won't be able to buy all the necessary things to maintain them or upkeep them unless they meet the hard, strict standards set by the plan. Until they can get themselves off of the thrall and Dormany risk index by not violating human rights anymore, then they will no longer be able to tap into the United States' wealth of military surplus.
Since they already have arms from the U.S., why wouldn't they just continue using those?
So you're right, they could continue using the weapons they have from the U.S. for a short period of time. However, it wouldn't take long for those weapons to become obsolete technologically or for them to run out of ammunition and things like that and for things to fall into disrepair. So you're right that they currently do have some weapons. However, they wouldn't be able to continue violating human rights for a while, and they know that. So they would then need to preserve those weapons for their own self-preservation for as long as possible. So they would probably stop using them on gratuitous things like violating human rights, and they would instead use them for preparing for national security until they can adapt to the thrall and Dormany risk index.
All right, so the changes they make to stop these human rights abuses in order to buy weapons, wouldn't they just go back to their old ways once getting U.S. sales again?
Yeah, that's a good point. But the plan is constructed in a way that if they do begin to violate human rights again, then they are again categorized as a higher risk client. So then again, we would stop selling to them.
All right, moving on. In what time frame would your solvency mechanism work?
So in what time frame would our solvency mechanism work? That's a good question. Fortunately, because once the plan passes, we would immediately stop selling to clients on the high risk index. It would take very, very short period of time for these countries to stop violating these human rights abuses or to violating human rights because they would see that the U.S. is planning on passing this bill and they would have an incentive to then adapt their policies to what the United States standards are.
Okay, so you previously mentioned something about technologically obsolete. How long does that take for a weapon to become that?
Yeah, so that's a fair question. We don't really have too much evidence that talks about technological obsolescence, but given what I know about the United States' arms sale policy, the United States is constantly innovating. U.S. arms manufacturers are always looking to create something new so that way they have something to sell. So without evidence, this is purely speculative, but I would assume it would take between like 1 or 2 years.
All right, thank you.
Cool. So let's talk about what just happened. So without the evidence in front of me, I was able to come up with stuff using some of the things that I had learned and read from the packet. That's a skill that you all should try and develop too, because you won't always have your packet in front of you, and you shouldn't have to read from your packet in order to answer some questions like that. The other thing is that you really just have to sound like you know what you're talking about more so than actually knowing all the ins and outs of your evidence. So you should know the ins and outs of your evidence so that you can use them in questions. But sometimes there's not always going to be a specific line from each card to answer those questions. Like most of the things that I said are things that I've come up with from what I read from the packet. They aren't quoting lines from the evidence itself. So that's one skill that you can work on developing.
In addition, it's good to write out questions prior, but don't feel limited to those. If you're really listening to the conversation you're having during this cross-ex, you can use information the other person is saying and make new questions on the spot. What we just did, his answers were improvised. So I used some of those answers and created more questions that were more relevant to the cross-ex.
Yeah, exactly. Adele did an awesome job asking follow-up questions to really push me on some of the points that I was making because, again, my answers were improvised. So if you think your opponent is fibbing or isn't telling the full truth, then you should be asking follow-up questions to sort of catch them on that.
And you're never going to know what they're going to say. So if they say something different from what you originally thought, then you can ask them to elaborate on that. Or, for instance, we were talking about technologically obsolete. You can use that and talk about it in like the context of one of the questions that you were planning on asking before.
Yeah, like everything I said about technological obsolescence, I know literally nothing about that. That's just sounding confident and finding ways to use words that sound compelling and convincing, tying in your evidence somewhat so that way you know that the judge knows that you kind of know what you're talking about, and then couching it, which just means phrasing it in ways that aren't certain. So I never said like, oh, I know this for a fact, or my evidence says this, because I knew it didn't. Instead, I found ways to sound like I knew what I was talking about without tying the evidence in directly.